Hey everybody, this is Dr. Jacobs and welcome to our lecture over Chapter 7, Survey Research. There's a few things that I want you to be able to do by the end of this unit, including I want you to be able to discuss the reasons for conducting survey research. I want you to be able to identify factors to consider when writing questions for interviews and questionnaires, such as simplicity, double-barreled questions, loaded questions, and negative wording. I want you to be able to describe different ways to construct questionnaire responses, including close-ended questions, open-ended questions, and rating scales. I want you to be able to compare the two ways to administer surveys with written questionnaires and interviews. I also want you to be able to distinguish between probability and non-probability sampling techniques, including simple sample random sampling, stratified random sampling, and cluster sampling, convenience or haphazard sampling, purposive sampling, and quota sampling. I also want you to be able to describe how samples are evaluated for potential bias, including sampling frame and response rate. So let's get started. Survey research involves using questionnaires and interviews to ask people to provide information about themselves, their attitudes and beliefs, and demographics. This is basically a snapshot into how people think and behave at a given time. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as retrospective self-report if it's about a previous past or if it's about a time period before. And our memories aren't super great, so sometimes that can be a problem for research. In particular, suicide prevention research, we struggle with retrospective reports or people reporting what previously happened because our brains are really malleable and our memory is not super strong. And so that causes problems with research in different areas sometimes. So a response set, this is a problem sometimes with survey research, and it's the tendency to respond to all questions from a particular perspective rather than provide answers that are directly related to the questions. And this can happen for several different reasons. One is a social desirability. And this is when people feel like they need to make themselves look better than they actually are. So if you're doing some sort of research on drugs and alcohol, if people know that other people are going to read the research, they might indicate that they don't drink as much as they do or don't do certain drugs when they actually do. Sometimes we can see this with research that is not anonymous, especially if your population includes people who are in the military and high clearance areas where they can't actually report the different things that they've done or attitudes that they have, such as like mental illness or things like that, because they'll be penalized for those things potentially. And so if you're going to construct questions to ask, and my firm position as an instructor is that we will not create these questions unless it's demographic forms, because this is an entire research area on its own. We already had our measurement unit where we kind of discussed my dissertation. And so this is a really hard research area to do. It's still one that I do myself, and it's tough. So again, we will not design our own questions for our projects. We'll use pre-existing measures. And so for this, if you do get into a point where you're developing measures and you're getting into that type of research, you'll have a lot further study for that. There's entire classes that you'll take on measurement if you continue in like psychological science for a PhD and things like that. One of the things that you need to do though, when designing a questionnaire or different types of questions to ask participants is that what are you trying to ask? What do you want to know? What are the research objectives? And these are really hard to do. I urge each of you to try a thing on social media. If you have like a Facebook where you can ask people questions, or if you use other social media that allows you to post questions that people can respond to, try to ask a question to collect some data from them. It's really interesting. I'll do this to collect data for my statistics classes so that they have real data to analyze, and people will misunderstand the question or they'll interpret it in a way I didn't know they would interpret it, or like it's not as clear as I thought it would be. And that's something that's really interesting when designing studies, where that you got to pilot a lot of these measures first to see what kind of problems they might have. And that's even before trying to do the version of a study where you're getting the psychometric information or that reliability and validity information that you want for those measures. So you might develop some sort of thing to collect facts and demographics such as age, gender, ethnicity, marital status, employment status, number of children living in the household, things like this could be household income. One thing that we have to think about is that we never collect information that we're not going to use within our study. It's considered unethical to have participants waste their time responding to questions that aren't going to be used in the study, that aren't a part of your informed consent as part of the study. And so for this, when you're developing your demographic form for your study, you'll want to make sure that you're following those APA guidelines about what information you should be reporting about your samples, because that's part of the readings that you all had previously. So behaviors, you might have people report behaviors that they've done in the past or ones that they plan on doing in the future. To remember, a behavior is something that could be observed. So if I clap, how do you know that I clapped? Well, if you observed it, you might have observed it by hearing it. You might have observed it by visually seeing it. If you had your hands on my hands, you might observe it by feeling my hands clap together. And so it's something that can be observed through your senses. We also might develop surveys based on attitudes and beliefs. This is one of the most common ones that we'll see in addition to the demographic form. And this is focusing on ways people evaluate or think about different issues or what their beliefs are. And so when we're developing these questions, there's some problems that we might have with question wording. So like if you use a lot of jargon or unfamiliar technical terms, that can cause problems. I remember when developing my measure for my dissertation, it was on self-efficacy of teachers to engage in suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention practices. Well, saying postvention, most people probably have no idea what that means. So if I use that in some of my questions, then that might make it so that they don't understand, then we don't get accurate data. If we don't collect accurate data or good data, then there's no reason to analyze it then. So we want to make sure that we're not using technical terms that people don't know. We want to be very precise with the language that we're using. We don't want to be vague or imprecise. We want to make sure that we're using proper sentence structure. We also don't want to have awkward phrasing or a lot of run-on sentences, or any run-on sentences actually, because if it's too long, it can overload the working memory, which then prevents participants from providing accurate accounts of their behavior, their beliefs, or whatever we're trying to gauge with the measure. Also, embedding the question with misleading information is inappropriate. And when we design these questions, we want to go for simplicity. They should be relatively easy to understand and straightforward. A lot of measure development people will recommend that they are developed at third grade reading level. We also want to avoid double-barreled questions. These are questions that ask two things at the same time. So if we say, do you want to go to the zoo and to eat ramen? Right. So that's asking two different things. Those we'd want to make two different questions, because someone might agree with wanting to go eat ramen, but might not want to go to the zoo, and vice versa. So to avoid this, we just write two separate questions, right? We'd write, do you want to go to the zoo? Yes or no? Do you want to get ramen? Yes or no? And so when you're developing measures to collect data to be able to analyze it, we got to be very careful not to create double-barreled questions. We also want to be careful to avoid loaded questions. These are questions that are designed to lead participants to respond in specific ways. And sometimes people might not do this on purpose. Sometimes you'll see this a lot with political campaign questions, so that they can use the data to say that these people support them or don't. And so one way to avoid loaded questions is avoid using emotionally charged words. And that will dramatically reduce the chance that you're creating a loaded question. You also often want to avoid negative wording, and we see this as a problem, but we also see it as a problem not to do it in some other ways. So let's talk about here how it can be a problem. One reason that we want to avoid negative questions or have like knots and things like that, it's because it's confusing for the respondent. If you've ever taken a test or a survey that said, what is not the best way to handle the situation? I'm just trying to make something up off the cuff. When we have the not piece, then we have to tie up more of our working memory to try to understand, what is this question actually asking? And when I'm responding, is it actually answering the question that was asked? And so this is really problematic because we won't a lot of times get accurate data because people are really bad about reading directions. I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, I think a lot of students really struggle with reading directions sometimes or reading full syllabi and things like that. And think about that with these questions for research that might be used for make policy decisions or to allocate funds for different things. Another problem we see is yay saying, nay saying. So yay saying is just the tendency to agree with all the items in a measure or all questions being asked by an interviewer. And the opposite of that then is going to be nay saying. And these are both problems that we see with this type of research. One way that you can fix this is to create incompatible items, where if you say, I always drink water, you could have as one question, you could have, I always drink soda. If they say yes to both of those, they're incompatible with one another, and we realize that there's a problem with the data that's coming from that participant. Another suggestion that our reading provided was that we have reverse formats. So sometimes you'll see questions, they're all phrased positively, but sometimes you'll see the scale anchors change. That's one way to kind of look for yay saying, nay saying to see if they're compatible with what was used. They also, some people would suggest using negatively worded items, but that can be really problematic because that really is hard for people to understand. And so something that you're going to notice with research is anytime that you do something, it might have a drawback or it might have a benefit, but that influences something else that you're doing that might cause a drawback or a different benefit. And so when we're doing these things, there's never going to be a perfect study. You're never going to have a 100% perfect, beautifully designed study. There's always going to be some sort of problem. And so what you have to do then is evaluate, okay, this is what I'm wanting to study. This is the problem that I'm seeing with this study. I can do this or this, and then kind of critically evaluate what the best method is to go forward and really kind of think about the pros and cons of the different approaches, because there will never be 100% perfect design study. So response to questions, there's a whole bunch of different types of questions that we can ask. There's closed-ended questions. These are yes or no questions, one-word answers. We have open-ended questions. So if I say, did you have a good day? That was a closed-ended question because that's yes or no. Open-ended questions, though, elicit more response. So how was your day is still kind of, people can be like, good. So that could be potentially not a good one. What about, what did you do today? So typically, people will then elaborate on the things that they're doing. And depending on what you're wanting to do with your study, both of these can be appropriate depending on what you're doing. There's also rating skills or Likert skills. Notice I said Likert, not Likert. So rating skills are from like 1 to 7, with 1 being strongly disagree to 7 strongly agree. If you create rating scales, you always have to have what each of the scale anchors mean within your paper. So for example, 1 would be strongly disagree, 2 could be disagree, 3 could be neutral. I'm just making things up, but you want to have the scale anchors, and there's a proper way to format that, which is in our APA manual. We have a whole bunch of different other types of ways that participants can respond to questions, such as semantic differential scales, pictorial scales, labeling response alternatives, and things like that. And so these different ones you can choose based on what you're doing. The most common ones that you're going to see within psychological science or social sciences behaviors is often going to be those closed-ended questions, open-ended questions, and rating scales of some sort. We also have response rates. So response rates are the percentage of people who are asked to complete a survey who actually complete it. And so often we have targets for how many, like what percentage of participants we want to complete our studies. The higher the percentage point, the better, because if like 80% of the people don't, then you have people self-selecting the study. And if you try to do random sampling, that can be a problem or a threat to your study. We also have interviewer bias. So if you're doing interviews, sometimes you'll hear this called as interviewer effects. And this describes all the biases that can arise from the fact that the interviewer is a unique human interacting with another human being. And so this can be problematic because if someone like scowls during something or looks like they really like a certain answer, sometimes there's just different effects that the participants will either try to give the interviewer what they want or try to not give them what they want, depending on what's going on. And so this can be problematic. And if you have a human interviewer, this is one of those things that could cause a problem from what's going on in the study. So, I mean, there's a there's an old book, and I don't remember which one it is, but it's by Malcolm Gladwell. And he reviewed a study that was done examining like people's response to different things. So like for example, like at I think it was MU, the University of Missouri. I could be wrong about this. There was a study done where they just had participants nod the whole time while they listened to ads. And just by the simple act of nodding, the people in that group versus the ones that had their heads still, they were more likely to buy whatever it was from the ad. They were more positively inclined to listen to that ad versus when people did this or shook their head no, they were less likely to have favorable opinions of the ad that was occurring. And so that just shows that like little things can really influence humans because we're really malleable, which can be problematic for research. There's also focus group research, and this is an interview about 6 to 10 individuals brought together for a period of usually like 2 to 3 hours. We see this a lot in marketing of new products. I remember as a kid, my mom got to go to some sort of focus group for toys, and I was part of it too. And she gave her opinion. We watched commercials, and I would say which ones I wanted, and she would say, which ones do you think you'd let your kid get? And I got a free toy. It wasn't one of the ones I really wanted from the ads, but they were doing that to try to gauge what was going on and how responsive people would be to their marketing. We see this in law. People do focus groups, like paralegals and lawyers will do focus groups of potential jurors for different cases so that they can kind of study what kind of jurors do they not want during jury selection process and which ones would they want to have if they possibly could. There's also panel studies. We also sometimes hear this called longitudinal panel study. This is where you see the same people surveyed at 2 or more points in time. There's a ton of different ones that do this. I believe there's a Seattle longitudinal study where they do research in waves. So at each point in time, it's referred to as a wave. There's the Ed Health survey. And even like this is more popular, not necessarily a scientific study, but there's like a documentary called 7 Up, and they go and interview these people every 7 years as they go across the lifespan. I think they got up to 56 up, and then the director of the film died. So I'm not sure if they got to 63 or not, but it's really, really interesting. And if you ever get the chance to go through and see any of the Up series, it's really interesting to see the same people across their entire lifespan. So with research, we also need to discuss sampling from a population. A population is composed of all the individuals of interest to the researcher. And so you actually will define what population you want to study. And when you're doing this, the way you identify the population that you want to study depends on the topic that you're studying. So for example, if I'm looking at suicide warning signs, I might want to narrow down my population to people who suffer from major depression, right? That might be one population that I want to study. And I might even want to narrow it down even more. Maybe I want to study major depression in midlife. So I'm narrowing down my population, which is really important to do because if we remember when we were examining the threats to the experimental validity of our studies, we want our population to be more narrowly defined. We want it to be more homogeneous or the same because that helps us determine if it makes it easier to have statistically significant results, and we can always replicate our study. So it's important not to just say college students or adults or things like that. You really want to look at what you're interested in studying and have a specifically defined population. And then once you define your population, you have to really think about it because the way that you do it can also influence the distribution of the data set that you get and subsequently what you can do with that data. So for example, one mistake I made from one of my studies, like I said, there's no perfect study, is I want to examine the suicide warning signs in, what was it? I just wanted to study it in college students. And that was really problematic because I didn't narrow down my population. And that gave me a J-shaped distribution. And so with almost all of the inferential statistics that you learned in your statistics class that you'll use when we get to our project, you have to have a normally distributed population. And it wasn't, because I failed to narrow down my population in a way that makes sense, because most people didn't have a suicide attempt, right? And so that made it really problematic for what I was trying to study. And so with that, I had something called floor effects, where most of the participants selected the zero option. So then a sample is a smaller portion of the population. There's things that we have to consider with samples, right? So it's a smaller portion of the population. We have to consider our sample size. We also have to consider how we're going to get that sample while we're designing our study. So sample size, increasing our sample size of our study increases the power of the test. What increasing the power of the test means is that we're more likely to reject our null hypothesis when it's false in the overall population, which often that's going to be one of our goals as a researcher, is that we're going to want to reject the null hypothesis or say there's significant differences, because that's typically what's going to end up published. We can't uh, manipulate our data or anything to do that, but like as a scientist, that's typically what we're wanting to do, because there's a bias of research journals publishing only statistically significant results, and that actually causes us problems with things like meta-analyses, where we're trying to see what the overall picture is. One way to conduct or to make sure that your sample size is big enough to run your study is using a free software called GPower to determine what sample size you should have for the analysis that you're conducting. And there are tons of videos on YouTube on how to do this for different analyses. And it's a free download to your computer that you can do. You can have a sample size that is too big, but that's why if you have statistically significant results, that we would calculate some sort of effect size like you learned in your stats class. And so with the power test, there's a general guideline that people want to have it about 80% powered. Whenever I'm doing studies, I like to have mine powered at 95%. So if we're looking at that in proportion form, I always try to power it to 0.95 when I'm using G power, even though it defaults to 0.80. So there's different sampling methods that the book talks about that you can review. There's simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, cluster sampling, non-probability sampling, convenience sampling, purposive sampling, snowball sampling, and quota sampling. If you had statistics with me, typically I go over three main types of sampling methods, and these are the ones that you'll probably use within your studies that you'll design. One is a simple random sampling. That's when every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected into your sample. So if we're making a joke, and or it wouldn't be, let's say like I had, and this isn't true, but say like I had 100 students in general psych, and I wanted to randomly select 5 people to win $1,000,000. So I'd take all 100 students' names, throw them in a hat, shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, and draw out 5 names. Every member had an equal chance of being selected into that sample. That's random sampling. That is our ideal. It doesn't happen as much as we would like, because it can be expensive. It can be difficult to do. A lot of times we don't have access to an entire population to be able to randomly select from it, but it is ideal. We also have convenience sampling. These are sampling methods that you collect the data just because you have easy access to it. This is if you say like we're wanting to do a study and we wanted to post it on social media to get people to participate, that would be convenience sampling. And those participants select in or opt in to doing your study, and you only get to them because they're easy to access. Snowball sampling we use often if we have hard to reach populations. So for example, one study that I did with a professor who used to be here, we did a study on survivors of cold case homicide, so family members of people who died by a homicide that was later classified as cold case homicide. And we used snowball sampling in that because we had our participants that we got from support groups help find other people within their networks and their other support groups to participate in our study. So it's really a good method if you're struggling to get participants for a study. And so the book talked about error. It talked about error with relation to sampling error, but there are 3 sources of error whenever we're doing things, which is the rationale for why we need to do statistics anyway. One of those is sampling error. We have error in our data set just because we took a sample from the population. There is always a chance that that sample will not represent the overall population, which is one reason why we do statistics in the first place. There's also something called measurement error. Measurement error occurs because we've measured whatever phenomenon. And so, like today in my stats class, we talked about how many cups of water did you have, right? And if I just ask that, there's going to be error in that. One person is from a different country where they use liters, right? And they're like, what's a cup? A cup's just a cup, because they use the entire measurement system. So, right. So, like, I would define a cup as 8 ounces, but I didn't do that within the question. So, just by asking that question, then people might round the cups or they might not remember accurately. Um, and there's so many things that go into from us just trying to measure it versus what we would actually have if we knew the answer. And then there's random error that we have as well. And this is error that's introduced into our observed scores or our X values for our data set, that we don't know, that we can't control. It could be the temperature of the room. It could be the color of the font. It could be that somebody was really loud and obnoxious during the test. There's a whole bunch of different things that can go into random error. And so all of those are why we need to have statistics to do these things. And so we won't design surveys like this for our studies. We'll use pre-existing ones. We may, though, develop our demographic form, which is considered a survey, and I understand why. But we might design those, but we will not design measures. So if you're studying depression, you will use the resources in the library to find a measure of that. Particularly psych test is a really good one to find those. You might also find some measures in articles that you might read about the topic, and you could ask different people to use their measures in your research, if that's a possible thing too. So I hope you enjoyed this week's lecture. I'm getting really excited that we're learning a lot of the content that we're going to need to be able to progress in the class and more soon. Have a great week.